Black Waitress helped an old man, then his lawyers arrived, with 4 bodyguards. Get out of his way. You people don't belong here. The words sliced through the cafe air like a knife. Before Amara could even look up, a cup of hot coffee flew from the man's hand and burst across her wrist. The heat seared through her skin, followed by the sharp crack of ceramic on tile. The cafe froze. The couple by the window stopped mid-bite. The cashier bent over the register, pretending not to see. Even her manager hid behind the espresso machine, eyes down, lips pressed tight. Amara crouched to gather the shattered pieces. Her fingers shook. The burn throbbed up her arm with every touch. She whispered a soft apology, though she wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to the man who hurt her, maybe to herself, for still believing that decency meant something here. The customer rolled his eyes, muttered something about people like her never knowing their place, and tossed a crumpled bill on the counter before walking out. The door closed behind him with a hollow chime that sounded like shame. Her knees felt weak. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with her own skin around hair. Conversations began again. Laughter. Spoons clinking. The world pretending nothing had happened. She kept her head down, blinking back the tears that blurred her vision. In that moment, she didn't feel human. She felt like a stain on the floor, something to be cleaned up and forgotten. Then came the sound of a chair sliding softly against tile. An elderly man stood up from the corner table. His hair was silver, his coat worn but neatly pressed. He walked toward her slowly, not to draw attention, but as if he were stepping into sacred ground. When he reached her, he offered a white handkerchief, its edges frayed from years of use. "Don't apologize for being kind," he said gently. His voice was steady, kind, and certain, the kind of tone that could hush even cruelty. Amara looked up at him, startled. There was no pity in his eyes, only recognition, the look of someone who had known what it meant to be unseen. For a second, it felt like time itself had paused, making room for something tender to exist amid all the noise. She wanted to ask why he cared, but her voice wouldn't come. She only nodded, clutching the handkerchief as if it were proof that goodness hadn't completely disappeared from the world. He gave her a small nod before returning to his seat. No one else noticed, but Amara did. She watched the way he sat back down, quietly, as if he didn't want thanks. It wasn't charity. It was understanding, and that, somehow, hurt even more. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as background, but as a person. That night, she lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed outside. Her wrist still throbbed from the burn, but it was his words that lingered. "Don't apologize for being kind." She kept replaying his face in her mind, that calm sadness in his eyes. Who was he? He had looked at her like someone who knew the cost of being gentle in a cruel world. She didn't know that the man who gave her that handkerchief was the same name, carved on the sign outside the cafe, Robert Caldwell. The owner, the man whose decisions shaped half the city, the one she thought lived in a world that would never cross paths with hers. A week later, the bell above the cafe door rang again at 8:47 in the morning. The sound carried differently, this time heavier. Deliberate. 5 men in black suits stepped inside, their polished shoes echoing against the tile. Behind them was a man with silver glasses and a leather briefcase. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. "Are you Miss Amara Johnson?" Her heart still. She nodded. The man gave a polite smile. "Mr. Robert Caldwell asked us to find you." Every head in the cafe turned. The only sound was the faint hiss of steaming milk. Amara's chest tightened, the scar on her wrist tingling as if it remembered. She could feel the stares, The unspoken questions. What could a poor waitress possibly have to do with men like that? She didn't know the answer. Not yet. But in that frozen moment, she felt something shift in the air. Quiet and irreversible. She didn't know it yet. But the man who had looked at her without pity was about to rewrite her life. Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. And if you've ever been humiliated for simply doing your job, if you've ever had to smile through pain just to survive another day, stay until the end, because this story is for you. Let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. The silence that had fallen over the cafe followed Amara into the law office like a ghost she couldn't shake off. Everything around her looked too expensive to touch. The marble floor gleamed under her shoes. The glass walls shimmered with the winter light. And even the air felt too clean for someone like her. She sat where the lawyer asked, hands folded in her lap, trying to hide the faint scar on her wrist. Across the table sat Victoria Caldwell, dressed in grey silk, her posture perfect, her expression colder than the marble behind her. Beside her, Ethan reclined casually in his chair, watching Amara with the kind of smile that people wear when they've already decided you don't belong. The lawyer, an older man with silver hair and careful manners, opened his folder. The reading began politely. Realistate, art, and other assets were distributed in phrases that sounded like another language to Amara. Her stomach knotted tighter with each word. She told herself she didn't belong here, that there must have been a mistake, that the men who came for her at the cafe had confused her with someone else. Then, the lawyer turned a page. His tone changed slightly. Softer, almost uncertain. To Miss Amara Johnson, he said, I leave Caldwell Dine Group in its entirety. The air cracked open. Ethan's chair scraped against the floor as he shot up. You're joking. Dad must have lost his mind. Victoria's hand gripped her pearl necklace, her voice low, sharp, and deliberate. This is absurd. A waitress inheriting our company. There has to be some kind of manipulation. Amara couldn't breathe. Her name hung in the air like something fragile that didn't belong there. She shook her head before she could stop herself. I don't understand. I didn't even know who he was, but her voice sounded small. A whisper that couldn't compete with the noise of outrage. The lawyer raised his hand calmly. There is one final letter Mr. Caldwell asked me to deliver personally. He reached into the folder and placed an envelope in front of her, sealed in red wax. Her name was written in Robert's careful handwriting, small, deliberate, like someone who thought deeply before every word. Amara hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a short letter on cream paper, the kind that smelled faintly of cedar and age. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. He wrote that he had noticed her long before she ever looked his way, that he saw how she treated every customer like a person, not a paycheck. He wrote that he had once watched her slip half her own lunch into a paper bag for a homeless man outside the cafe. He wrote that she reminded him of who he used to be, a man who believed that kindness could build something stronger than money ever could. He admitted that he had lost that part of himself chasing power, and that giving her this company wasn't charity. It was his apology to the world, his last good decision. Amara's eyes blurred, and she pressed the letter against her chest. Around here, the room seemed to fade the marble, the glass, the cold perfume in the air. For a brief moment, all she could hear was Robert's voice in her head. Soft and steady, don't apologize for being kind. Ethan scoffed. But quiete now, almost uncertain. This doesn't make sense. She's no executive. You think Dad really meant this? Victoria didn't shout this time. She just leaned forward, voice calm and sharp as a blade. Money attracts opportunists. Maybe she played the perfect little act, and he fell for it. Amara met her eyes for the first time. There was no anger in her face, just disbelief and a quiet strength she didn't know she had. I didn't play anything, she said softly. He saw me because no one else ever did. The lawyer's tone regained its formality, but even he couldn't hide the faint tremor in his voice. Everything Mr. Caldwell left was documented and witnessed. His wishes are final. The silence that followed was different this time, not cold, but heavy, alive. Amara stared down at the letter, the ink smudged slightly by her tears. She could almost feel Robert's presence beside her, as if he were watching to see whether she would stand or shrink. When she finally rose from her chair, she wasn't sure if her knees would hold. The hallway outside looked endless, lined with gold-framed paintings that reflected her shadow. She walked toward the elevator slowly, the letter still in her hand. Kindness, she thought, had just become the most dangerous inheritance in the city. The story broke like wildfire. By the second morning, her name was plastered across every news site, her photo beside words that cut deep. The Maid Queen. The headlines read, "The waitress who inherited an empire." Some anchors laughed as they said it. Some shook their heads in disbelief. But all of them spoke her name, with the same tone, curiosity wrapped in contempt. Amara Johnson had become a story for people to mock over breakfast. When she walked down the street, whispers followed her. A woman pointed and said, "She must have been his lover." A man near a newsstand chuckled, saying, "Maybe she brought more than coffee to that old man's table." Amara kept her head low and kept walking. Every step felt like walking against wind made of knives. She told herself it didn't matter, but the shame burned hotter than the coffee that had once scalded her wrist. By Monday morning, she stood in front of Caldwell Dine Group's headquarters. The tower stretched into the grey Boston sky, a monument of glass and power. She had never seen it up close before. The revolving doors glinted like armor. She walked forward, holding the worn brown purse that had carried her life for years, and nodded at the guard. He stopped her with a raised hand and a polite but firm tone. "Employees use the back entrance, ma'am. Deliveries and staff only." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The same silence from the cafe filled her lungs. Then she met his eyes and said quietly, "I'm the owner." Her voice didn't rise, but it landed heavy in the air. The man blinked, unsure if he had heard right. Another guard looked over, recognition dawning with embarrassment. She watched them stumble through apologies. But the sting had already done its work. Inside, the building smelled like perfume and polished money. She rode the elevator alone, the reflection of her face surrounded by glass and chrome. For a second, she saw her own doubt looking back. What was she doing here? A waitress in a world built for people who had never served anyone but themselves. When the doors opened, she stepped into the conference floor. Laughter spilled out before she even entered. Ethan was at the head of the table, his tie perfect, his smirk sharper than his words. Around him sat 12 men and women in suits that could pay her rent for a year. When he noticed her, the room fell silent, but his eyes glimmered with amusement. "Welcome, Miss Johnson, or should I say, Madam Owner." The sarcasm in his voice made a few people chuckle. He gestured to the seat at the head of the table, careful not to touch anything. Amara sat. Ethan leaned back and flipped through some papers, pretending to be thoughtful. "Since you're the new head of the company, I'm curious," he said lightly. "Do you even know what EBITDA means?" The laughter returned, low, and cruel. Someone muttered, "Maybe she thinks it's a drink." Amara's face flushed, but she didn't look away. "No," she said slowly, "I don't." The room stilled for a second, ready to laugh again, but she kept going. "I don't know what EBITDA means, but I know what hunger feels like. I know what it's like to work 10 hours and still wonder if you'll make rent. I know how it feels to be invisible until someone needs to feel superior." The words fell hard, heavier than any insult they had planned. Ethan's smile froze, and no one else spoke. Amara stood, her pulse pounding, but her back straight. She didn't wait for permission to leave. The hallway outside felt colder, but the air finally belonged to her. She pressed the elevator button and looked down at her reflection again. This time, her doubt wasn't there. She walked out of the building with her hands still trembling, her heart still breaking, but something new burning in her chest. It wasn't anger, it was purpose. What they meant to humiliate her with had only given her a weapon they could never understand. The next morning, the headlines were still screaming her name. The Maid Queen, the waitress who stole an empire. Every newspaper stand in Boston carried her face, twisted by the cruel angles of camera flashes. She walked past them quietly, holding her coat tighter, pretending the words didn't crawl under her skin. Inside, the burn of humiliation had turned into something sharper. It no longer hurt the way it did before. It had started to harden. When Amara entered Caldwell Dine Group's headquarters for the first time, even the elevator seemed to hesitate. The receptionist avoided her eyes. The security guard checked her ID twice before asking her to wait. Then, as she stepped toward the executive entrance, a voice called out from behind the desk. "Employees use the back door." Amara turned, meeting his eyes with a calm that wasn't calm at all. "I'm not an employee," she said softly. "I'm the owner." The silence that followed was the kind that leaves an echo. By the time she reached her office, the whispers had already followed her upstairs. She could hear laughter through the glass walls. Some called her a lucky waitress. Others wondered how long she'd last before the board found a way to push her out. When she walked into her first executive meeting, she was met with polished suits and cold smiles. Ethan sat at the head of the table, the seat that used to belong to his grandfather, pretending not to notice that everyone else was watching her like a mistake that refused to go away. He asked if she even knew what EBITDA meant. The laughter was soft but sharp. Amara looked at him and said, "No, but I know what hunger feels like." The words landed heavy. The room went quiet. She didn't stay to see their faces twist. She left, heart pounding, cheeks burning, but her hands steady. By the time she stepped into the hallway, her humiliation had already begun to reshape itself into defiance. Now, a week later, she sat in the same office, the city's nightlights reflecting across the windows. That's when Linda Tran knocked and entered. The company's CFO, Vietnamese-American, calm, immaculate, and unreadable. She greeted Amara with the professional courtesy of someone who had learned to survive in silence. At first, their conversations were short, mechanical, numbers, schedules, reports. Linda's voice carried no warmth, and Amara didn't blame her. In a place where kindness was seen as weakness, warmth was a dangerous thing to share. It was close to midnight when something shifted. Linda stayed behind after a meeting. Watching Amara pore over spreadsheets she didn't yet understand. She asked why Amara bothered reading all of it herself. Amara smiled faintly. "They think I'll run," she said, "but I've run out of fear my whole life." For the first time, Linda's expression changed. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. In the weeks that followed, they began meeting late, long after the building had emptied. over takeout boxes and cold coffee. Linda showed her the cracks in the company's numbers, transfers that didn't add up, contracts that vanished after being approved, branches that suddenly reported losses under Ethan's supervision. She explained quietly that Ethan was creating a crisis, driving down the company's value to buy it back at a fraction of its worth. The more Linda spoke, the more Amara understood how deep the betrayal ran. It wasn't just numbers. It was a war of silence and arrogance, dressed in paperwork. Every chart was another bruise on Robert Caldwell's legacy. Linda leaned back, her voice lower now, almost bitter. "They think you'll give up," she said, "that you'll sell it back just to make them stop." Amara looked at her, the city lights catching the gold in her eyes. "I'm not selling anything. Not the company. Not my dignity. Not the truth." Linda studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Something like respect flickered between them. Quiet but real. Two women from different worlds, both invisible in rooms filled with power, both learning that survival sometimes starts in silence. When Linda left that night, Amara stayed by the window, the city glowing below like a sleeping beast. She finally understood what Robert had seen in her, not her strength, but her refusal to stop believing that kindness could still fight back. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the storm outside. She was learning how to build one of her own. The night Linda left, Amara stayed behind. The office felt heavier than usual, the kind of quiet that waits for a secret to be found. She stared at Robert Caldwell's portrait above the fireplace, the old man's eyes seeming to follow her in the dim light. Something in her chest whispered that he hadn't left her unarmed. Not in this war. She remembered what Linda said about Robert keeping detailed records and realized that somewhere he might have hidden the truth he couldn't say out loud. Her hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the frame. The painting was heavier than it looked. When she tilted it forward, she heard a faint click. Behind it, hidden in the wall, was a small steel door with a keypad. A folded envelope was taped beside it with a note in Robert's handwriting, "For the one who still believes in people." Inside was a paper slip with 6 numbers. Her fingers shook as she entered them. The lock clicked open with a soft sound that filled the entire room. Inside the vault was no gold, no jewelry, no symbol of wealth, just folders, flash drives, and small labeled tapes, each with dates and initials. A faint smell of dust and paper filled the air. She lifted one of the tapes, labeled Victoria, another, Ethan. The third said, "Board Meeting March." She placed one in the old recorder that sat nearby and pressed play. Robert's voice came through, fragile but steady. "If they bury the truth, let this light expose them. If they forget what it means to serve others, remind them." Amara's throat tightened. The tape crackled. Then the sound of voices filled the room. Ethan's laughter, followed by a sentence that made her blood run cold. "Fire the black staff first. They're replaceable." Then Victoria's voice, dripping with disdain. "As long as the help knows their place, the world stays balanced." Amara pressed pause. The room seemed to shrink, her hands clenched against the edge of the desk. For years she had felt the quiet sting of looks, the whispered insults, the locked doors she was not meant to open. But hearing it, recorded and preserved, turned her shame into fury. The old pain that once made her bow, her head now lifted it higher. Robert hadn't just trusted her, he had prepared her. She opened the folders next. Financial records, transfers to offshore accounts, false reports signed in Ethan's name. There were copies of internal memos, meeting notes, even letters Robert had written but never sent. Each one detailed how the people who claimed to love him were dismantling the company he built. Amara read every page. her heartbeat matching the rhythm of the clock on the wall. She could almost feel Robert's presence, guiding her through the evidence, showing her what truth really costs. When she looked up again, the city lights shimmered through the window like watchful eyes. Her reflection stared back. No longer the woman who once apologized for existing. She whispered into the empty room that this was no longer about revenge. It was about justice, about dignity, about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. She gathered the files, carefully placing them in her briefcase, and whispered a vow that seemed to echo off the walls. "I'll make it right. Robert, I swear I will. All night." Amara couldn't sleep. The files she had found in Robert's vault were spread across her dining table, lit only by a single lamp. Every document felt like a loaded weapon. Every recording, a bullet aimed at the people who had destroyed his legacy. Linda sat across from her, hair pulled back, glasses reflecting the dim light. For the first time since they met, there was no distance between them. They were no longer employer and employee. They were soldiers preparing for war. Linda traced a finger along the timeline of transactions. "Ethan's plan is to collapse the numbers," she said. "He wants chaos. Then control." Amara nodded, voice low but steady. "Then we'll give him exactly what he wants. We'll let him believe I'm breaking." In the days that followed, they moved like shadows through the company's corridors. Amara began to play the part Ethan expected, distracted, hesitant, defeated. She let rumors spread that she was considering selling. Each whisper reached him like bait. Meanwhile, Linda quietly encrypted copies of the evidence and contacted Dr. Hamilton, who agreed to act only when the proof was undeniable. The night before the meeting, Amara stood by her window, watching the Boston skyline flicker under snowlight. Fear had been her companion for too long. It had whispered to her in every insult, every locked door, every look that said she didn't belong. But tonight, something else had taken its place. Not anger, not vengeance, clarity. She thought of Robert's voice, "If they bury the truth, let this light expose them," and felt her heartbeat steady. The next morning, she arrived at Caldwell Tower 10 minutes early. The marble floors gleamed like ice beneath her shoes. Executives passed her without a word, pretending not to stare. At the elevator, her reflection looked back, not the waitress from the cafe, but the woman who had learned to fight with silence and grace. She pressed the button for the 30th floor. The conference room was already full when she entered. The city stretched out behind the glass like a frozen ocean. Ethan sat at the head of the table. "Suis perfect," smiled sharp. Beside him, Victoria leaned back, the picture of polished cruelty. Around them, investors waited, papers stacked neatly, ready to witness her defeat. Ethan's voice broke the stillness. "You ready to sell?" "Waitress." The laughter was small but poisonous. Amara set her briefcase on the table and looked him straight in the eye. "No," she said quietly. "I'm ready to graduate." The words landed like a calm before thunder. No one spoke. Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time. Amara took her seat at the head of the table, her rightful place, and opened the briefcase. Inside was everything Robert had left her. Truth, weaponized. And as the room filled with the faint hum of tension, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one on trial. She was the judge. For a long second, no one moved. The hum of the city outside the glass was the only sound in the room. Ethan leaned back, arms crossed, wearing the smug look of a man convinced he had already won. Victoria's perfume filled the air, sharp and cold like her smile. The investors waited, bored, expecting another predictable defeat. But then Amara clicked the latches on her briefcase, and everything changed. She pulled out a single folder, placed it neatly on the table, and slid it toward the center. Her voice was calm, quiet, almost too gentle for what she was about to unleash. Before we talk about selling, there are things you all deserve to see. Ethan laughed, low and dismissive. You think anyone here wants your little stories? This is business. Not. His voice stopped when Amara pressed a small remote. The room lights dimmed, and the projector came alive with Robert Caldwell's voice. If they bury the truth, let this light expose them. The sound of that old voice filled the space like a ghost, returning home. Then came Ethan's own words, recorded clearly. His tone, arrogant and cruel, fired the black staff first. They're replaceable. Laughter followed on the tape. Then Victoria's cutting voice. As long as the help knows their place, the world stays balanced. The silence that followed was suffocating. One investor shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down, as if he had just seen something indecent. Ethan tried to laugh again, but it came out as a stutter. This is fake. You're manipulating. Amara didn't respond. She reached for the next file. Financial statements, transfers, offshore accounts. Linda connected her laptop to the screen, pulling up copies of signed documents. The numbers didn't lie. Every fraudulent transaction traced directly to Ethan and Victoria. For years, they had been bleeding the company dry while blaming others. Then the door opened. Dr. Hamilton stepped inside, a calm storm in a grey suit, carrying a box sealed with the federal crest. His voice was steady. These documents are official. The FBI has verified every recording and every financial record. The investigation began 3 weeks ago. After Ms. Johnson provided the preliminary evidence, Victoria turned white. What did you do? She hissed. Amara's hands didn't tremble. I showed them what you tried to hide. Ethan slammed his fist on the table, veins visible under his skin. You think this changes anything? You're still nothing. You don't belong here. For the first time, Amara smiled. It wasn't mockery. It was truth. Good, she said softly, because I came to build a better world than yours. Her voice carried across the glass and marble like thunder. Linda stood behind her, silent but proud. Dr. Hamilton placed the signed warrants on the table. The investors exchanged stunned looks, then started gathering their papers, distancing themselves from the Caldwells. One of them muttered under his breath, I won't be associated with this. Victoria's composure cracked. Her chair screeched as she stood. You'll destroy this company, everything my husband built. Amara met her gaze. No, you already did. I'm just saving what's left. The screen changed again, this time showing security footage. Ethan burning documents in Robert's old office. His voice caught clearly. Burn everything. The little black girl can't find out the real numbers. Gasps echoed around the room. Ethan's face drained of color. He reached to turn off the projector, but Linda blocked him. Eyes steady. It's over. Victoria's voice broke into a scream. You'll never belong here, never. Amara didn't raise her voice. That's the difference between us. She said, I don't need to belong. I just need to be honest. At that moment, Dr. Hamilton's phone buzzed. He glanced down, then looked at Amara with quiet satisfaction. It's done, he said. The press just released it. On the screen behind them, a breaking news banner appeared. Caldwell family under federal investigation. The room erupted into chaos. Ethan cursed, trying to call his lawyer. Victoria sank back into her chair, trembling with rage. The investors filed out quickly, whispering into their phones. Linda closed the laptop. Amara just stood still, breathing deeply, watching the storm unfold exactly as she and Robert had planned. For years, they had called her invisible, a nobody, a girl who served coffee and should have known her place. Now those same voices were echoing in panic, drowned out by the weight of their own lies. Amara gathered the documents slowly, each movement precise, controlled. When she finally looked up, the room was almost empty. Only Victoria remained, shaking, eyes burning with hatred. "You think this makes you powerful?" she spat. Amara shook her head. "No, it makes me free." And with that, she walked out calm, tall, unbroken, leaving behind the empire that had once humiliated her to crumble under its own arrogance. Outside, the snow was falling over Boston again, quiet and relentless. For Amara, it no longer felt cold. It felt clean. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered everywhere. In the following days, headlines filled every screen and newspaper in Boston. Ethan Caldwell, heir to a corporate dynasty, was led away in handcuffs after being charged with fraud and obstruction. Victoria, once the queen of marble boardrooms, stood in front of her mansion watching federal agents load boxes into black vans. The empire that had humiliated others for decades crumbled within a week. Power that had once silenced rooms was now a name whispered in disgrace. Amara watched it all unfold from the window of Robert's old office. The same skyline that once looked impossible now lay quiet beneath her. There was no joy in seeing their downfall, just a strange stillness, like the world had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. For so long, she had dreamed of this moment and imagined it would feel like victory. But now, standing at the heart of it, she realized it felt more like peace. She walked toward the fireplace, where Robert's portrait hung. His kind eyes still watched her from the frame, just as they had the day she first met him in that small cafe. She whispered softly, almost afraid to break the silence. "You were right, Robert. Kindness was never weakness. You saw something in me before I did. You believed in a woman who didn't even believe in herself." Her voice trembled as she smiled faintly. "You taught me that revenge isn't destruction, it's correction. It's the courage to rebuild what others tried to break." For the first time, she understood that Robert hadn't chosen her to punish his family. He had chosen her to redeem what they had forgotten, to remind the world that leadership meant service, not domination. Outside, snow began to fall again. Each flake drifted past the glass, like forgiveness descending from the sky. Amara stood there, feeling the quiet around her, the hum of the city far below, the weight of everything she had lost and gained. The scars on her hand still burned faintly, but now they no longer symbolized pain. They marked transformation. She whispered one last time, her voice steady now. "I'll keep your promise alive. I'll make sure this company stands for what you wanted it to be." Then she turned off the light, leaving only the portrait illuminated by the soft glow of dawn. 6 months later, the world looked different. The snow that once felt cold against Amara's skin now glittered like light on glass. The name Caldwell, once spoken with contempt, had become a symbol of change. Caldwell Dine Group was thriving again, not through fear or power, but through respect. And on the cover of Forbes magazine that month, beneath bold silver letters, a headline read, "The Waitress Who Changed Corporate America." Amara stared at the magazine in her hands as sunlight poured into her new office. She didn't smile for the fame or the wealth. She smiled because she knew what it had cost to get here. Every bruise, every insult, every sleepless night had turned into something unbreakable inside her. She thought of Robert, of the man who once told her not to apologize for being kind. His voice still echoed when she faced the board, when she stood in rooms where people used to look through her instead of at her. The day of the grand opening arrived with clear skies. Cameras flashed. Reporters called her name. And yet all she could focus on was the small hand clutching hers. Zoe, her 8-year-old daughter, looked up in awe at the tall glass building that bore the new sign, Caldwell Dine, redefined with dignity. Amara knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "You see this, baby," she whispered. "This is what kindness can build." When the ribbons stretched before her, she felt the crowd quiet. Her heart beat slow and steady. She took the microphone, her voice calm but strong. "To every waitress who's ever been invisible, I see you. To every worker who's been told they don't belong, you do. Because dignity doesn't come from where you start. It comes from what you refuse to lose." Applause rippled through the air. But what touched her most was the sight of the staff waiters. Cooks, cleaners, standing proud, heads high, eyes bright. They were no longer background figures in someone else's story. They were the story. As she cut the ribbon, Zoo clapped beside her, laughter mixing with the cheers. For a moment, Amara looked up at the sky, whispering a thank you to the man who saw beyond class, beyond color, beyond fear. She realized then that success wasn't her revenge. It was her redemption. And for the first time in her life, she felt whole. The night was quiet again, the kind of stillness that only winter can bring. Amara stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking over Boston's skyline dusted in snow. The city that once made her feel invisible now shimmered below her like a promise fulfilled. The lights of her restaurants glowed in the distance, tiny beacons against the cold. She wrapped her coat tighter, watching her breath fade into the night. Power, she thought, had once been something she feared. Now she understood it for what it truly was: not control, not wealth, but the ability to change something for the better. She thought of all the faces she had met in the past 6 months. The waitresses who came to her in tears, saying her story gave them courage. The workers who no longer whispered when they spoke to management. The small acts of respect that had started rippling through her company like sunlight touching dark water. For the first time in her life, she realized that the most lasting revolutions are not shouted. They begin in silence, in the quiet choices people make when no one is watching. Her eyes lifted to the horizon, where the skyscrapers cut across the moonlight. "If you've ever felt small," she whispered, "remember this. Even a quiet voice can shake skyscrapers when it speaks with truth." The wind caught her words and carried them into the night. She smiled, thinking of how much pain it had taken to arrive at this peace. Every wound, every scar, every cruel word had carved her into someone who could stand here without bitterness. She closed her eyes and remembered Robert's handkerchief, the first kindness that broke her silence. That moment had planted a seed that no cruelty could kill. Now, years later, that seed had grown into something that fed others, not just food, but dignity, kindness. She realized, had been her greatest rebellion. It was not weakness. It was the loudest revolution the world had ever known. Because when you choose compassion in a place built on cruelty, you don't just survive. You rewrite the rules. The snow thickened, falling softly onto her hair and coat. Somewhere below, a delivery driver laughed with a server carrying boxes of fresh bread. A street musician played a tune she recognized, soft and hopeful. Life went on, imperfect and beautiful. Amara took one last deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. This, she thought, is what healing sounds like. Quiet, steady, alive. Then, she turned to the camera on her balcony table. The little red light blinked. Waiting, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "If this story touched you, tell me how it made you feel." Share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness still matters. And if you believe that hearts can change, stay with us. Subscribe to Emotional Echoes, where stories heal hearts, one tear at a time. She paused, her eyes glistening with gratitude. Thanks for listening.